We ready?
I think Chris said just to hold just for a minute because Facebook is a minute behind us.
We are all good to go.
Oh, good to go. All right, great. Whenever you're ready, Ange.
All right. Well, hi, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our 2021 primary prep event. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Angelique Hinton, and I am the president of the Norristown chapter of the NAACP. First, I want to thank all of our partners for teaming up with us on this event tonight. So that's Mainline NAACP, Cheltenham NAACP, Progressive MontCo, Community for Change, Community Hero, and the Lower Merion and Narberth chapters of the League of Women Voters. I'd also like to introduce you to our chat monitor and our timer, who is Adrian Seltzer and Monica D'Antonio. Their job is to keep us on schedule and engage with the chat audience. I'd also like to give a huge shout out to thank Monica D'Antonio for putting this all together. She is absolutely amazing, and we are so grateful for her at our NAACP branch. So we truly hope you get a lot of useful information out of this event tonight. Primary elections, especially in the odd years, are often overlooked, but that's an era that we think you need to correct. And we all need to be voting in every single election. So primary elections have a lot of meaning. They're important, and they're one step to building our political power. So we have some great programming tonight. So we're going to get ready to get started. And then we're going to talk about, do primaries really matter? So with that, I'm going to introduce the first panel. We have Miss Adrian Seltzer. Raise your hand, Adrian. She's doing double duty tonight. She is the second VP of the Mainline branch of the NAACP. She spent 30 years working in the polls twice a year, every year, and fought against the PA voter ID law. Currently, she is the political action chair for the Mainline branch of the NAACP. She is a Democratic committee person, a member of the MCDC Diversity Committee, and is in her second term as judge of the elections. She's also lobbying for the endorsement process to be revamped so that people have more choices during the primary. We love to have more choices. Next, I'm going to introduce David McMahon. He is a Norristown resident and a member of the leadership team for Progressive MontCo. He's also a co-founder of NOPE, which is Norristown Opposes Privatization Efforts, and he played a major role in preventing the sale of the Norristown sewer system to Aqua PA. And finally, last but not least, we have Mr. Mark Jones, who is a community activist and part of the leadership team for Community for Change and Progressive MontCo. Mark believes the primary is the first place in the voting cycle when people get to show their power. So with that, of course, we feel that primaries matter. And so we're going to help you understand why we feel that way. So I'm going to turn it over now to Adrian, and let's get started.
Okay, I'm first going to unmute myself, and then I am going to put this into present. Nope, can't put it into present first. I have to hit share screen. Okay, everybody can see? All right, so again, I'm Adrian Seltzer, and I'm about to tell you why primaries matter. Here's the what and why of primaries. There are elections twice a year, every year. It's my motto. The first one is in May, and it's the primary, and it's April during presidential election years. This is when you get to choose who will be on the ballot in the general election. The political parties make endorsements. These are their suggestions of who you should vote for, but you should do your own research to make sure that you agree. What's on the ballot during an odd year primary? Because every year who's being elected is different. Depending on your township or borough, you could be voting for commissioners or council members, school directors, the mayor, tax collector and constable, jury commissioner, and PA judges. Local government has two primary roles: providing service for its residents that the private sector cannot or will not provide, enacting and enforcing rules for the good of the community as a whole. Local elections decide. Your school board directors who oversee curriculum. This is really important because you want school directors who realize that the curriculum over the years has been whitewashed, and we want it to be reflective and diverse and inclusive. School disciplinary rules, which are also important because students of color have historically been disciplined harsher than others. Building and property management, and teacher and staff contracts. Special education, it's really important that that happens because there's a lot of kids that need help. And also the budgets, which then leads to your school taxes. Local elections also decide your board of commissioners, your borough councils, mayor, and they oversee. This is going to be like a ridiculous amount of things that they oversee. Okay. Police and emergency services, and that includes police budgets. So make sure you ask your candidates, how are they going to be spending those massive police budgets, which could be anywhere from 25 to 40, even 50% of the whole community budget, the whole township, borough, or whatever budget. It ranges all through Montgomery County to that high. And that affects your taxes and trash and building codes. And all this is the stuff that affects your everyday life. So I want you really to pay attention to this. And we also have the judges, the judicial elections. So judges at every level of the PA courts, that's from magisterial justices all the way up to the Supreme Court are on your ballot. They interpret PA law. They determine cash bail and sentencing, other important things. They oversee employment and discrimination cases. And as we saw in 2020, they upheld our election. So, are you willing to have these elections decided by a select few, or are you going to have your voice heard? Elections, these local elections can be by 6 votes, by 2 votes, somebody can win. I've seen it time and time again. So it's really important that you get out there. So register to vote if you're not registered by May 3rd, or apply for a mail-in or absentee ballot by May 11th. But don't wait that long. If you're going to apply for a mail-in or absentee ballot, do it as soon as you're off this Zoom at www.votespa.com. And you can check out your sample ballot, what your ballot's going to look like, so that you yourself can see exactly who's on the ballot. And then you can find those candidates and ask them these questions. And you can also research the candidates and issues at one of my favorite spots. It's www.vote411.org, which is presented to you by the League of Women Voters. And I'm also on the Voter Services Committee for that too. So I'm telling you, vote on or before May 18th. And if you have any questions or comments, I'll go put these links in the chat for you. And everyone take care. And I am going to hand this over to David.
Wait, Adrian, can I ask you a quick question before we move on? Can you just clarify for people that they applied for mail-in ballots last year and they selected, to get a mail-in ballot. Can you just explain to them what needs to happen this year? Because they won't automatically be sent a ballot.
well, they were probably sent something in the mail, but you have to reapply each year. So that so-called permanent voter status is really an annual thing. So you apply at the beginning of the year, and if you have permanent status checked, then you don't have to apply. They'll just send you ballots the rest of the year. But at the beginning of each year, you have to do that.
Can I just want to jump in and ask a question, Adrian or to anyone, but I got a letter in the mail. I was just trying to help a woman in my precinct with this today. I got a letter in the mail that said, you checked a box that said you want to mail in ballot all the time, right? And then I got a letter that said, if you want off this list, like if you want to go back to voting in person, here's a slip that you fill out and send back to voter services, which I did because I do want to go back to voting in person. So did anybody else receive that letter?
If you are on that permanent list, you're going to get the application in the mail, but you can still apply online if you don't fill out that, but you still have to apply. So they're sending you the application, or you can apply online if you have permanent status checked. I think they had to really fix the wording because it's very confusing.
Yes, and so one last question to clarify what Monica is saying then for other people. If this year they got the application, they didn't get the letter, right? But they just got the application and they don't want to vote by mail this year. Do they have to do anything, or can they just show up at the polls on election day if they don't fill out that?
If they haven't mailed back a ballot, it'll show that they haven't mailed back a ballot. And when you come in, your name will be on and it'll say you haven't mailed back your ballot, and you'll be able to vote in person. But if you want to be taken off the list, there is a link, and you can do that all at votespa.com.
Thank you.
Okay, so now I will introduce our next speaker in this segment, which is David. And I'm going to unshare the screen.
Hi, thank you. And thank you for having Mark and I here tonight from Progressive MontCo. My remarks tonight are not so much directed toward motivating an individual voter to turn out, but rather in helping an organization identify the best time for outreach to build their power base. And before discussing why voting in a primary election matters so much, I wanted to just take a step back and briefly go over the US system of voting as it's conducted in both our primary and general elections. So discussing some of the drawbacks of our election process is with highlighting the nature of some of the challenges that would be encountered and be addressed so that organizers can overcome them. Our system of voting is referred to as a winner-take-all voting system. And that's the way our primaries are run as well. And it's a system that has a couple of basic advantages. It's very simple to understand, and there's ease in counting the vote totals, but there are some disadvantages. Probably the fundamental disadvantage is the underrepresentation of voting groups. Women, a community of color, third parties, young people, voters in gerrymandered districts all get underrepresented in a winner-take-all system. And they do nothing to provide any group that makes up less than half of the population in a voting district. This can lead to no choice elections. Since many areas are dominated often by a single political viewpoint, the winner-take-all system will often result in elections that feel predetermined in their outcome because one party has a monopoly on power. And in a primary, party endorsements can heighten this sense of no choice. Another disadvantage, this can then lead to decreased voter turnout with limited choice and little chance of feeling they can influence the outcome of an election under these rules. Many people will unsurprisingly choose not to participate. And just as a side note, this really is the most crucial thing to address and try to turn around. To have more participation. And often under a winner-take-all system, there is often no incentive for a party to reach out to opponents or build cross-party support, meaning that candidates can fail in an ongoing way to not address challenging issues and ignore entire constituencies. And negative campaigning in these situations is often, too often, and unfortunately, an effective strategy. So now the goal in pointing out these drawbacks is not to make this seem overly daunting or an overwhelming process, but to be clear about highlighting the need for both encouraging voter participation overall and in the need for organizing our own supporters to mobilize sufficient turnout to ensure a win for the candidate we feel best represents us. And the timing of this we will discuss a little bit later. Mark in particular will take on that role. But there are positive ways to address a primary situation. Some very positive outcomes of this process is that you can get the candidate on record before the likely or possible shift a little more to the center in a general election. Oftentimes, the general elections sort of ratify the party brand, so to speak, but that brand is formed during a primary debate and conversation, which is why it's so essential to have those. The primary functions as kind of a real world test for a candidate, vetting basically compared to what they may appear to be on paper. And a wider primary field often yields a stronger final candidate in the end. A well-run primary can build enthusiasm and participation, but only if it's an explicit party goal. It's not a given that there is interest from a party in getting anything other than the win, right? And the more engagement that there is from voters in the run-up to a primary, the greater potential to elect a candidate who would be accountable to voters. If those voters have been given a genuine role in vetting and the debate and the conversation process. So conducted well, primaries create candidates that are responsive to their constituents. So why do primaries matter then? Well, they matter in that they create the possibility of stronger participation, turnout, and enthusiasm. And the turnout's crucial because the votes are the medium of exchange in politics. A group or a region or a district that doesn't generate much turnout will be left out of the conversation. And if they're not needed by a candidate to win, they can be further marginalized or not brought to the table and are unlikely to be able to bring an elected official to account when necessary. So vote in the primaries and encourage others to do so and build the excitement around your candidate and your ideas and platform. But from an organizing standpoint, be aware that the foundation of all this needs to be laid well before the day that votes are cast. For example, in a parliamentary system, parties that represent different factions and groups and special interests form their coalition after an election. But in our system, this strategizing and negotiation happens prior to the primary election. And so the organizing of a grassroots coalition has to happen very early in the primary process in order to be influential. And this is the area that Mark will elaborate on further.
Is that for me?
Yes, sir. You're up.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Norristown NAACP and Monica for putting this together. I'm going to share my screen now. Did it? All right. So my focus, what I'm speaking to everybody about today, is the power in primary, the power of primaries, right? My little piece of art here, I'm new to making nice pictures on Zoom calls and stuff, slideshows, all power to the people. And one of the things that I'm going to try to get people to see tonight is primaries is really where we build this power. And for the things that most of us that are on this Zoom meeting here are four: revolutionizing, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or an independent, right? Building that power happens through primaries. So, firstly, what is power? The definition in the dictionaries, two different, right? The capacity or the ability to direct or influence the behavior of others or the course of events. Second definition, a little bit more simple. Power is the ability to act or produce an effect. Part of the goal in building power in primaries is because we want to see change. We want to see appropriate legislation that comes from the candidates that you choose to support. One of the things David was mentioning is if you wait to the general election, if you don't push people in the primaries, that power will leave and those folks will go more towards the middle. That's usually how it works. So what you want to do is get people on record before the general election, right? So some of you might be asking, my first slide said, all power to the people. What does a primary have to do with power? Well, in a primary, you build power through coalition. During primaries, a political party is a coalition of different political interests and factions, right? So progressives are part of the Democratic Party, and I'll get into Tea Parties and a couple of other factions in a second. So you negotiate policies during primaries, right? So I think a lot of people have been hearing just primary done. Like now you hear that terminology a lot, right? And that's actually been successful for a lot of grassroots campaigns to get things accomplished, to get things done in America. So using the primaries, we get to choose which faction is going to lead which party, right? So if we don't come out and vote during a primary, if we don't show our power as a voting bloc during a primary, right, then we're going to end up with somebody who gets elected in a primary that may not stand with our same values. Somebody who ran, who's already in the middle, who's not revolutionary, who doesn't want to see change in any way, right? That's kind of what happens when we don't use the primary process to engage in power game. So one of the ways during the primary that we engage in that power game is through our vote, right? So you heard Adrian say earlier, somebody can win a primary a lot of times by 2 to 4 votes in some of our smaller areas. And even in some of the bigger races, not maybe 2 to 4, maybe 100 people. But either way, on this call currently, I think we are at about 47 people. This would legitimately be a voting block. And if everybody on this call shared the same values, what we would want is to show our power to the entire political spectrum by pushing forward a candidate that shared our values. Doesn't mean that we all are going to agree. That was just an example that I wanted to give folks. So in coming up with an idea to do, I reached out to a couple of people for some statements regarding why they feel primaries are important. Somebody who I met in my travels here in Montgomery County, Ms. Linda Fields, offered me one that I thought spoke to the message that I wanted to deliver today. We demonstrate our power by setting the precedent, selecting the best candidate capable of persuading the collective constituents that our priorities, policies, and ideas are best for everyone, and they, the candidate, are able to win the majority votes in a general election. Please be clear for this star that she put here. This was like in a message, and this bottom line was all capital and bold letters for me to make sure I said this to everybody on this call. This is only possible when we use our collective power by voting in every election, right? So some people would say we showed power in 2020 by the way we came out and voted, the numbers we had. I know Norristown increased their voter turnout. Thank you, Ms. Hinton over there at Norristown got to working. Thank you, David. Thank you, Monica, right? But if we don't vote in 2021, then we did not truly gain any power in 2020, right? It's kind of what happens. I think Obama was elected in, what was that, 04, 08, 08, right? Well, he didn't keep power because we didn't vote in 9 and 10. That's not what we did. Like, voter turnout went back down to 30 and 40%. So you can't expect power from your agenda if we're not supporting that throughout this process, through every election. Now, if you are not part of the solution, you are part of the problem. Eldridge Cleaver, right? The solution is voting in primaries and putting people on notice during these primary elections that we would no longer, whichever party you vote for, that you won't stand for shenanigans in politics, right? Like that, period. Like that's whatever angle you come from, your power is in your vote. So I said earlier, I was going to give you some examples, right? These are the two best examples in the power of primaries. The Tea Party being the best example because, as we just saw, our president came from that faction of the Republican Party. That faction of the Republican Party may not have been as strong, I'll say, 10, 15 years ago, right? But they started with we will primary every one of you Republicans that don't do what we want you to do. And that's what they did. That's how they gained their power. We ended up with Donald Trump in the end of that, right? Progressive candidates. I'm from New York. I have a love-hate relationship with, drawing a blank on her name, but Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right? But she primaried a establishment Democrat who was in a stronghold in his place, right? But he wasn't progressive. So she primaried him, she wins, and now the progressive caucus in the Democratic Party would seem to have more of a voice than what they had just 4 years ago. So those are examples of the power in primaries. I want to close out my part with going back to my initial slide. All power to the people. If we as people stand out in primaries, if we as people continue to engage, then we have the power. There's an old saying, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. Well, the squeaky wheel in our case is our votes. And if you're not happy with things, you have to get out there and vote. They're going to talk in a second about the amendments that they're adding for us to vote on. These are things that, again, our power says something. Imagine if they got a response that was 60% of the population saying all of the same thing. This is what we want, right? That's a sign of power. There's power in primaries and there's power in people. Please vote. Primaries are important. Thank you. And forget who's next, so I'm gonna just hand it off to Angelique Hinton. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark, Adrian, and David. You guys were awesome. And you really, I think, hit home the importance of primary elections. Primaries are typically, as you guys said, when parties on either side decide who they feel is going to represent their party as the candidate. A lot of times, those parties aren't representative of people of color. And so the candidate that the parties may choose is also not going to be very representative of communities of color. And so this is why it's important for all of us to make sure that our voices are heard, right? And that we're participating in these primaries so that we can push our elected officials to do what is in the best interest of our community. Because at this point, people that get elected pay attention to who votes. And I always say who votes most matters most, right, to elected officials. So we have to show up and turn out in every single election so people understand that we're paying attention and we're going to hold people accountable. So now, beyond voting, another way we can hold political power is by volunteering or working at a polling station. And so good poll workers and volunteers can make or break an election. And that is true because, you know, sometimes you walk in and it can be either slow or chaotic in there. And so having great poll workers there is really important. They can also help people feel secure about voting, or they can also alienate people and discourage voters altogether, you know, when they're pressing people for ID. And so it's important that we have the right people in polling places. And it's also important that we have a diverse group of people, different, you know, people from communities of color, people of all ages that are in there, that are paying attention to what's going on and are trying to make things run smoothly. And so we are going to learn a little bit more about why working at polling places matters from a Ms. Pam Margolis, who is passionate about civic engagement and African-American voter habits. As a public servant, she is an Area 15 committee member, a member of the MCDC Diversity Committee, and a member of the Perkiomen Township Parks and Recreation Committee. As a former judge of elections, Pam streamlined the inefficient election process at our precinct, reducing voter wait time by more than 50%. We all want Pam at our polling place. Pam hopes to be elected as the first African-American female supervisor in Perkiomen Township in November. And she's a strong advocate for education, which we love, education advocates, and will attend Westchester University in the fall to pursue her doctorate in education. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Pam.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here. So without further ado, let me share my screen and let's get to it. All right. So can you all see? All righty. Get my side of it working. So poll working is for us. Why people of color need to work the polls. Today, I'll talk to you about elections and poll working. Number one, what poll working is. Number two, the current state of voter habits. And three, why poll working is for us. The election and voting processes are for us. Poll working is for us. Just because you may not see our people working the polls doesn't mean poll working is not for us. It is for us. What is poll working? Have you ever wondered what kind of people work the polls, or thought, how do these folks get these jobs? Poll workers are ordinary people like you and like me. Now, each state is different, but in PA, you need to be 17, must have lived in the state for 30 days before the election, and live in the district you want to work in. There are a minimum of 5 jobs available for poll working: judge of elections, minority inspector, majority inspector, minority clerk, and machine operator. The judge of elections is in charge of the people and the activities for the day. The majority and minority inspectors manage the poll books and distribute the voter ready slips. The minority clerk handles the numbered list of voters list, and the machine operator assists voters with casting their vote. Now, don't let all this information intimidate you. It's truly not that complicated. If you're interested in working the polls, all you have to do is contact voter services. They will be glad to help you get signed up. Work the polls. According to the Election Assistance Commission, it's difficult to find enough poll workers. As the former judge of elections for my precinct, I can attest to that. My position had been filled by a person who was ready to go back to their own precinct. Then I was appointed to the position. As judge of elections, I helped find workers for my board. If you were willing and trainable, I would have taken you. There's no special skill set required. Many hands make light work, so the more poll workers you have on election day, the faster and smoother things run. A smooth voting location allows voters to get in and out and get back to their jobs and their lives. If people perceive that election day will be a long, drawn-out hassle, they won't vote. and we want everyone to vote. People died so we could get the chance to vote. We want to ensure everyone has an opportunity to exercise their right to vote. And teens. Pennsylvania wants teens to volunteer. If you're 17, have a good academic record, and live in the county you want to volunteer in, you can be a poll worker. You'll need a permission slip, and I'm told you can get some kind of credit for it. You will be assigned a real job at the polls, not just coffee runner. When I became judge of elections, our high school volunteer had been working the elections for a couple of years and knew more about how the day would go than I did. She went off to college after that May election, and I missed her the next election. The next election cycle, I recruited more teens, and 2 of them returned and brought friends. In the big election of 2020, I had something like 4 teenage women working and running the polls. We need teens. Their work is invaluable. I'm proof of that. Power to the polls. Let's briefly talk numbers. According to the Census Bureau, of the 12.8 million people in Pennsylvania, Black people make up approximately 1.4 million of them. On our side of the state, there are approximately 829,000 people living in Montgomery County. I'll give you a moment to check out the other numbers. Historically, African Americans only turn out for major elections. This past election followed that trend. Our people showed up in record numbers to vote Trump out. So in MontCo, while we may have only been roughly 10% of the population, we helped change history. Because of us, Biden got something like 90% of the Black vote in Pennsylvania. Black Pennsylvanians, Montgomery County residents, you, me, us. We showed up and showed out to protect our future. Another way to protect our future is to get involved in the election process. Getting folks registered into the polls is important, and there's more we can do. African Americans are still being hassled and turned away from the polls because those in charge do not care about our interests. Another way to fight suppression and disenfranchisement is by working and running the polling locations. We need to ensure that those who mean to do us harm are not going unchecked at the polls. We need to be the voice that says, hey, I see what you're doing, and that's not okay. Prior to working the polls, you'll get trained. You'll learn the rules of what's required and what isn't. When you work the polls, you'll be able to ensure that people of color get their chance to vote. That means ensuring that voters are not turned away from the polls for bogus reasons. You can ensure that people of color are not asked to show ID unnecessarily or because it's easier for the poll worker. You'll have a hand in ensuring that people of color are being treated fairly and respectfully. You'll be ensuring that our interests are protected. You'll be making a difference. To be sure, Election Day is a long day, but you get paid, there are breaks, and at my precinct, there was pizza. The work is interesting, and it's so much fun to be part of history. Think of it this way. You'll have a ticket to the hottest party of the year. Who would want to miss that? Ready to roll to the polls? Here's the contact information. Thank you for your time. What questions do you have for me? Okay. Question?
Yeah. At this election coming up, judges of election and inspectors of election are elected. And they're on the primary ballot. There's still lots of openings. I don't know why I'm fuzzy, but you can also, if you decide to do this, if you were inspired by Pam, and I'm also a judge of elections, and I can tell you that I look forward to election day twice a year because I get to see my neighbors. You have the interaction with the other people working. It's really a lot of fun. And if we've convinced you, take a look at your sample ballot. The link was in the chat, and see if anybody's running for judge of election or somebody you're not fond of is currently judge of elections. And then all you have to do is do a little write-in campaign. The petition period has ended, so you can't get your name actually on the ballot, but you could do a write-in campaign. And if you get 10 votes and it's more than anybody else, you can win. That's it.
Right.
It would only take 10 votes and 5 for inspector of election. Try and get more than that, but.
Right. That's right. You have to get on a ballot, and so you should really start researching it early. But if you've missed the ballot signing time, you can totally get a bunch of your friends together and tell them to write you in. In fact, you could stand outside the polling precinct, pass out some goldenrods or something and say, hey, vote for me for judge of elections. These are positions that are very, very important, and most people don't know about them. And a lot of times people get just popped into these positions who aren't representing our best interests.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a couple questions in the chat.
Okay.
We have one is, do you know if there's a citizenship requirement? So you said you gave the age 17 years old. Do you have to be a citizen, naturalized citizen, if you're undocumented? Do you know any of those rules?
I am afraid I don't.
Okay.
I would assume you do have to be a citizen.
Okay.
I think you do have to be a citizen because we did a huge, we made a huge effort to recruit young poll workers. I do election work with young people, high school age, and that did come up, and they do have to be a citizen. So, we tried to figure out other ways that people can still participate, but to be a poll worker, you do have to be a citizen.
Right. There are lots of other ways that you can participate, even if you cannot run the polls. You could offer to buy pizza for the group.
Yeah.
You could send over some hoagies. You could offer to drive people back and forth. You could drop off water. There are lots of things that you can do, and every little bit helps. I guarantee you, judges of elections, they're there, 15 hours that day? Somebody stops and does a coffee Wawa run? That's beyond fantastic. Donuts are my favorite, but
Awesome. We have just one more. I'm sorry, Adrian, oh, we have 2 more questions in the chat. You want to take them, Adrian? Or ask Pam?
Pam, since Pam's no longer a judge of elections, and just recently our salaries were, or stipend were raised, yes, poll workers do get paid. Judge of elections makes like about $300 now for the day.
Right.
And inspectors of election, I think it's 2 and change. Yeah, it's meaningful now. And so the constable of elections, the clerk, the machine operators, everyone gets paid. Get that cash, you all. Yep. And can nonprofits or not-for-profits organizations endorse a candidate? I believe that is not allowed. But if somebody asks your personal opinion, you can always give that. That if you start endorsing a candidate, that can lead into your tax exempt status being revoked.
Right,
Mhm.
there's no campaigning
Right.
at the precinct.
All right, did we get all the questions answered?
Oh, and
Did
Hakeem
you-
had something, he said, you do have to be a citizen, but however, canvassing for candidates provides an opportunity to earn positive money for a good cause. And I think that's a good point.
Listen, I always say, guys, there's a lane for all of us. Pick your lane and get in it and do everything you can to make a difference, right? Because this all matters. We see, we know in our community, we have been underrepresented. We have schools that are under resourced, right? We have, lots of Black and brown children right now are suffering with, juvenile justice system issues, and there's all kinds of things, and all of this matters. And that's why we have to really start paying attention, and we have to make sure that we're voting in every single election and finding a way to contribute to this process. All right. So with that, I want to thank Pam so much. You were amazing. And so now we're really about to get to some serious stuff, because there are some upcoming questions that are going to be on the ballot. And whether or not you're affiliated with a political party, you still have the right. You can't vote in a primary if you are not affiliated with a political party, right? So you can't be independent and vote for a candidate in the primary. So sometimes people will just pick a party so they can vote in the primary and then go back to independent. But the bottom line is, regardless, you still have the right to answer these questions. And they're very, very important. So even if you can't vote in the primary, please pay attention to the information that we're getting ready to provide to you now, because a lot of times ballot questions are very serious. They're changing the Constitution, right? There's all kinds of things that are happening in these ballot questions that are very, very important for us in our day-to-day lives. And so we have someone that is going to go over this information for us tonight and just give us the information, right? We're not here to tell you what to do, but we're here to inform you so that you can make an informed decision. And so I'm going to now introduce Jamil Mogil, and she's going to go into this a little bit deeper. Jamil is an attorney in private practice and principal of Enact Strategies, which is a government relations firm. Over the last decade, Jamil has focused on expanding voter access, securing our elections, educating the public on civics, and ending gerrymandering in Pennsylvania through her work as a PA election protection director with Common Cause, a voter protection attorney with the Obama re-election and Hillary for American campaigns, leading Fair Districts PA resolutions process, and as a vice president for the PA League of Women Voters, passing the first new PA election laws in 80 years and overseeing the Marcy's Law ballot question challenge, another very important ballot question that came up a few years back, and she was involved in kind of just overseeing that process and pushing back on it a little bit. So I'll let her explain that to you. She's currently voter services chair for the Lower Merion and Narberth League of Women Voters. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jamil. Thank you so much, Jamil. Jamil? Is Jamil here?
Okay, I had to unmute myself.
Oh.
That helped. You think I would have done enough
gorgeous.
by now. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to my good government allies, my democracy warrior friends, because yes, this is really what it's all about. I'm probably going to have a much more dense topic. I know Eddie Graham might be on to join me. So if he comes on, he might add some commentary. Supervisor in Springfield Township and president of the Cheltenham chapter or branch of the NAACP. So my name is Jamil Mogil. I'm going to get right to it because we have so much to talk about. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's hope I do this correctly too. Let's see. Oh, we're at the bottom. And I want to go into present mode. Is this right? Everybody sees this okay? Thumbs up? No? It's not showing? Share screen. Let's do it again. How about now? Okay, great. Okay, so what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about the 2021 primary election ballot questions. And of course, this is a lot, so feel free to put questions in the chat. I know Monica, Adrian, all of us will be looking at that, and I will more than gladly answer questions because it is a lot that we'll be talking about. But it's pretty awesome that we as citizens, we get the chance to decide Pennsylvania law. So that's what I like to tell people because it is empowering. So let's make sure that we tell our friends, our family, our neighbors, because these are big decisions. So how do we even get to a PA constitutional amendment? How does it get to the ballot? I think this is really important to start with. So first, like any other bill, it's proposed in our House and our Senate, which are the two chambers in our General Assembly. And then the bill must pass not just once, okay, but 2 consecutive sessions by both the House and the Senate by a simple majority. Okay, so it's not just one term, but it's 2 consecutive legislative sessions. And then what's really important is that there's notice to all of us. And that means that they've got to advertise the Department of State in all 67 counties. And then voila, it comes to us as the voters. Now it sounds pretty simple, but it's a long, arduous process. And if it's not followed, that means you got to scrap it and start all over again, which recently happened here in Pennsylvania. Our last Department of State, our Secretary of State, Kathy Bookvar, unfortunately resigned after the notice was not done on a ballot question, thereby ruining the fact that it could ever get to us on the ballot. So there's consequences to this. So the process really needs to be followed. But what's really important also, there's no veto power by the governor. So this is a done deal. It's put through the legislature and it's turned over to us to say yes or no, and it doesn't go to the governor's desk. So there are 4 primary ballot questions. I just took this snapshot. I want to tell everybody, hey, all registered voters, you heard Angie say it, all registered voters can vote on this ballot question. So if you have a neighbor or a cousin, I'm just giving you random people, maybe your Grammy, they think they can't vote because they're an unregistered, an unaffiliated voter. The largest group of new registrants in Pennsylvania are unaffiliated or independent voters. Guess what? They can vote on these 4 questions. So you want to make sure that they know in our closed primaries, which Dave told us all about, our closed primary system here in Pennsylvania. Well, guess what? They can still vote on these ballot questions because everybody in Pennsylvania has a say on amending the Constitution. Okay, so let's kind of get to it. Ballot question 1, it's a doozy. So I'm going to leave it up for a while. I'm going to read it. We are going to have time to go over this, and I want everybody to know that great resource, vote411.org. Everything that I'm talking about today, it's all there for you. You're just going to head there. It's the League's nonpartisan, trusted resource. You could type in your address, and you're going to see all the questions and all of this. Now, the question here in italics, that's what you're going to see on that ballot right here. That's what the ballot question. Now, very important also, people have been wondering who writes these questions, right? And they sound really complicated. I was looking up the other day and I just want to tell everybody, we have a PhD level that is required to read these questions. There's actually a company and a nonprofit that looks at all the ballot measures across the United States, and Pennsylvania ranked that you need a PhD to read our questions. So let's get to it. So this is all about the emergency powers. And the first question and the second question deal with this. So shall the Pennsylvania Constitution be amended to change existing law and increase the power of the General Assembly to unilaterally terminate or extend a disaster emergency declaration and the powers of the Commonwealth agencies to address the disaster, regardless of its severity, pursuant to that declaration, through passing a concurrent resolution by simple majority, thereby removing the existing check and balance of presenting a resolution to the governor for approval or disapproval. I don't know about you all, but I'm kind of exhausted just reading the question to you. So what does it really mean? Well, if you vote yes, you're saying that I agree to give the legislature, by a simple majority vote, the sole power to take away the governor's existing authority to make disaster emergency declarations and coordinate as is needed with all the relevant Pennsylvania agencies. Like, think about what's happening now, the COVID pandemic. The governor has an emergency declaration and he's coordinating with the Department of Health and all the agencies about the vaccine rollout, the closures, the health, the safety and welfare of all of us. But some people think maybe it should be the legislature. So if you vote no, you're saying no. I don't think we should give the legislature, by a simple majority vote, the sole power to take away the governor's existing authority to make disaster emergency declarations and coordinate with relevant Pennsylvania agencies. So again, you might be thinking, this is still kind of crazy and I don't understand what this means and how it impacts me. So there's more for you. Here's some background. This amendment, and I know this is a lot that I've put up on here. Again, these are dense questions that I'm going to kind of go through and answer your questions afterwards. This is all available. I can also make sure that we send out, if anybody needs it, this is available in just a simple 4-page document with all of these bullets. But this is really about the governor's COVID-19 response. The legislature, which is of a different political party than the governor, they don't like each other and they don't like that the governor closed things down like schools and businesses. And so they tried to get around the governor because this is really important. There is a process by which the legislature can currently say, hey, we want to end, and that's why you see that concurrent resolution. That means to continue on and have these emergency declarations, okay? I know these words are confusing, but the legislature, they said, no, we want to end your emergency declaration, governor, and they fell short of the overturning the governor's veto, because the governor, of course, wasn't going to overturn his own emergency declaration. So it went back to the legislature, who needed 2/3 to overturn the governor's veto. So this is the regular legislative procedure. Does everybody get that? So, the governor, he isn't all powerful. There is the ability for the people's house, the legislature, to come and say, look, we got 2/3, we're going to override your veto. But guess what? They fell short. It went to court. They didn't do it. Really, really important. If this passes, this is how consequential and important this is. This would be an exception to that legislative procedure of a veto override. So we would be essentially saying, if this passes, that in the cases of emergency declarations, that the governor's veto, it's not about that anymore. You don't have that 2/3 procedure. So I think it's really important to give context too, because only 4 other states right now require a legislative vote to extend or terminate, which is what we're voting on, a governor's emergency declaration. And I'm sorry, I had these all appearing, in the fade and the movement of, so it's probably overwhelming. You all are probably reading this, but these are some reasons to vote yes or no. And again, it can be overwhelming, but on one hand, maybe you're saying that I think the legislature, 253, we have the largest legislature in the country. we think that the legislators should be deciding to end or continue an emergency declaration. So this would lessen and weaken the governor's current authority. And I want everybody also to know who's listening or evaluating these questions, this is not just about the current situation in COVID. This would apply to any future emergency, whether natural disaster, even the opioid epidemic. That is a current emergency declaration that provides funding so that we can fight the opioid epidemic. So it's very important to consider that it's not just about what's currently happening, and it would apply to any governor, whether you like the current governor or not. This would be, if this is passed, it would apply to any future governor. So the reasons against it, it's pretty hard to consider that that this would be up to a 253 legislature and that they would be administering disasters and emergencies and coordinating with relevant agencies. Right now, that's the governor. He appoints the different heads of the agencies, and that's a lot easier than 253 people to coordinate. And it could potentially present a lot of hurdles and future disasters. And it removes that check and balance that we already have of a 2/3 legislative vote to override a governor's veto. So does anybody, maybe I'll look to see, if Monica, maybe after each of the questions, if people have questions, but I would say maybe, yes, we can convert. I see Monica's asking me, converting the info to PDF. Yes, I will send all of this out so that all the groups who are on here, anybody's listening, has this information. And again, it's all available on vote411.org. So question 2, and then Monica or Adrian, feel free to interrupt me if people have specific questions about the ballot questions, but it's a lot of material. So go ahead, Adrian.
Someone asked, they had read in the Inquirer how this could affect food stamps.
Yeah, so this is going to go to this next question, which is also about emergency management, and I'm gonna get into that example, and I'm also going to talk about what happened in Texas. As we all know, they just had a natural disaster shutting down much of the state, and what would that look like if these laws are passed? So the first question and the second question, Adrian, it's great that person asked you about that because they kind of go together. Somebody asked, just going back to the process, I see Monica told me that somebody asked, to change the Constitution, does this need to go through the second term of the legislature? Yes, as I mentioned, it's these bills, before they even get to us on the ballot, they have to go through not one, but 2 consecutive sessions of the legislature and be passed in each of the chambers by a simple majority. So yes, to that question, if I understand it correctly. So let's get to ballot question 2. I'm just going to take a sip because a lot of talking. Okay, ballot question 2 is also about emergency declaration and management. And I'm going to let you all read the question because it's a lot as I go along. Shall the PA Constitution be amended to change existing law so that a disaster emergency declaration will expire automatically after 21 days, regardless of the severity of the emergency, unless the General Assembly takes action to extend the disaster emergency? The governor may not declare a new disaster emergency to respond to dangers facing the Commonwealth. Unless the General Assembly passes a concurrent resolution, the General Assembly enacts new laws for disaster management. I don't know about you, but that does not really read like a question. And it can be very confusing. So what does it mean if you vote yes? And what does it mean if you vote no? So if you're voting yes here, you agree to change existing law to limit any governor's disaster emergency declaration, no matter the severity, whether it's COVID, a natural disaster, the opioid epidemic, to 21 days from 90, unless and until the legislature votes by a simple majority to extend the disaster emergency declaration and take away the governor's authority to manage new emergency and disaster situations beyond 21 days. It's a lot. Again, we'll be going over it in more detail, but if you vote no, You disagree with changing the existing law that provides any governor with the power to issue emergency declarations without a 21-day limitation or a simple majority vote by the legislature, and any governor would retain that authority to act in emergency and disaster situations. I know it's a lot. Take a deep breath. It's also about emergency declarations. It also stems from the same thing, that the legislature doesn't like what the current governor is doing. So some arguments for, and then I'm going to talk about some context. You know, this is granting the legislature, which we elect from different districts throughout the Commonwealth, the sole power to manage these disasters. Some people want that, you know, and it's limiting an emergency declaration to 21 days from 90, unless the legislature decides to extend it. And it removes that customary legislative procedural requirement that I just talked about, so that 2/3 needed to override a governor. And then it provides sole authority to extend a declaration, which currently resides with the governor. So this is really about a balance of power and who you think should be in charge of emergency disasters. And again, it's not just about the current governor and the COVID pandemic. This would be about all future disasters, no matter the severity. So I told you 253 legislators, that would mean they would need to convene every 21 days, so every 3 weeks in Harrisburg, okay, to decide whether to extend or end an emergency disaster, okay? We saw what happened in Texas. Not only, and that's a pretty big state as well, not only did, you know, would they maybe not be able to convene if there was a natural disaster like that? They didn't even have internet, so they couldn't even virtually convene. So we have to consider there could be huge logistical and administrative hurdles to convening. And this also reduces the power of somebody that we chose as voters to represent our entire state and act in an emergency. It also really could impact, and this is something that Adrian brought up that somebody talked about, that it weakens the ability to access federal funding, that all important FEMA or National Guard, all the times that we really need to act quickly in a disaster. Look, if you don't act quick, lives could be lost. It could worsen a disaster. So we have to consider that if we don't act quickly, that we could lose benefits and SNAP benefits. That's for food, you know, something like food administration and food stamps, which are incredibly necessary here, even in the economic state post-COVID pandemic that we're in. And because of an emergency declaration done by the governor, we have the ability in Pennsylvania to make sure people can access those benefits. So everything is linked beyond just COVID, right? That I told you, the opioid pandemic, all of the clinics that they have, the opioid, the mental health and wellness, the centers, these are all because of emergency declarations. If this is passed, that would mean 253 legislators would be convening. I don't even know how they would operate it, but some people may feel that it should be in the hands of the legislators. So any questions? I did, you know, I do have up the next question, but the first two really deal with emergency disasters. So if anybody has any questions about that, go ahead, Adrian.
Yeah. So someone asked, so this has already been through 2 sessions of the legislature.
Yes. Just for some background and context, you can also look, I don't know, I usually have the background. Yes, so the background of the first one is also the background of the second one. And it really came about because of a conflict between the governor and the legislature. When the legislature didn't meet that 2/3 veto to override the governor, because look, they wanted to end the emergency declaration. They felt they should open businesses. There's a lot of legislators who don't even wear masks. There's actually some legislators who died So it's really important to know that there's a different take on how we look at the pandemic and how we administer emergency declaration help or emergency service help. And when that didn't work, the legislature, they went to the PA Supreme Court. Why your judicial elections matter? Well, guess what? The PA Supreme Court said, this is the way it is. Like, you didn't meet the 2/3 legislative veto override. So this declaration stands. So again, while we got to tell people to vote, everything matters to upholding our laws. And again, most states, more than 2/3 of the country, have a current system like we do. Only 4 require a legislative vote to extend or terminate a governor's authority to declare emergency declarations.
And,
So anything
and
else? I know we're going along and we're already cutting into time, so I want to get moving. Any other questions on questions 1 and 2?
just a comment that I thought was really good. This is the very definition of executive authority under the separation of powers. So, yes.
Right. And, look, there's one way to look at that as a statement of that's why we have a checks and balances of the 2/3 legislative veto override. But there's other people who believe that there should be more of a separation of powers. I would say, I work with the League of Women Voters. I'm an election attorney. I like to think of it more of a balance of power, and that we have to think also about administratively what's going to help, and you as a voter should be thinking, what's really going to help us if we have an emergency disaster, something like that happened in Texas with power and water. I mean, calling in the National Guard. These are all things that are significant to our safety and our health and our welfare. Okay, moving on, because we have 2 more questions to talk about. Okay, ballot question 3, totally different topic, but this is also why it's so important and really special that we get to make these decisions around questions and the law. Again, all registered voters, unaffiliated, Green Party, Libertarian, I don't care what you are, you get to vote on these ballot questions. And this one is about the equality of rights based on race and ethnicity. So it looks pretty simple, a lot less to read. Shall the Pennsylvania Constitution be amended by adding a new section providing that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged because of an individual's race or ethnicity? I'm thinking, okay, I see nobody should be denied or abridged based on their race or ethnicity. If you vote yes, you agree that all levels of Pennsylvania government, entities, and institutions be prohibited from discriminating against individuals because of their race or ethnicity. But if you vote no, what's that mean? You disagree with changing Pennsylvania law, since current state and federal laws, including the PA Constitution and the Equal Protection Clause of the US Constitution, already provide protections against discrimination by all levels of Pennsylvania government, entities, and institutions. So you may already be thinking to yourself, this is probably not as simple as I thought this was going to be when I read the question. So let's talk about it a bit more, because the background here I think is significant. This was introduced in the wake of police brutality cases. Look at what just happened. This is still happening. It's a very big issue and concern and systematic. It's literally plaguing our country. So it was brought up, but it was really brought up to, for lack of better words, kill another bill, which we already talked about. Okay, so this is how political parties often try to make their own power grabs that hopefully we can remove that first ballot question, which was to limit a governor's authority to make emergency declarations. But that didn't happen, right? Because we're looking at it and it was overwhelmingly passed, including by both political parties, and now comes to us on the Pennsylvania ballot. So I really also want to encourage people to think about who they're voting for. Is this something like, who's putting these bills forward? Are they agreeing with it? You should be looking up, does my representative think that this bill or these laws are a good idea? I know also we do not have any requirement for vetting bills. There's no requirement to have hearings. There is no requirement to have law experts or testimonials, public hearings. So if you're interested, all the groups that are part of this tonight all work on making sure that our government is accountable to us. The very term representative means they represent us. So it's a bit of me going on my soapbox to tell you, make sure you know who's passing these bills. So our current PA Constitution, it does have a section that prohibits discrimination by PA government against any person in the exercise of any civil right. So this proposed amendment, so if we were to vote yes on it, it would be about protecting individuals, okay? Individuals. So I alone, as even a white woman, would be protected if I felt that I was being discriminated against by, say I wanted to apply to a Penn State University, and I felt that I wasn't admitted because of my race, I would have the ability to do that. Now, I would also be able to still do that under current laws, but it would be an individual case, okay? So the PA and constitutional and federal laws, I'm not gonna get too much into that, but they do provide very broad protections against discrimination. We're very fortunate to have a broad base of protections against discrimination. And this is very important to know, this is not an outright ban on group considerations of race, whether it's in hiring, specifically around admissions to schools. So I want people to know this is not an outright ban, but it is possible. And this is again why the judicial races matter so much. The interpretation of these cases, guess who it comes down to? It comes down to our judges. So these judicial elections hold so much weight. So I want everybody to know they're all tied together, but we as voters hold a lot of power in how those decisions are being made. So any interpretation of this law is going to be decided by our PA Supreme Court. So just to talk a little bit further about some arguments for, well, you may be thinking this is about a PA law. That's right. That's promoting states' rights independent and separate from the US Constitution and federal laws. And it's specific about prohibiting individual racial and ethnic discrimination. I told you what was currently under the PA Constitution. This is more specific. And this could eliminate preferential treatment in those underrepresented groups. A lot of people don't like that there are group considerations in hiring or maybe even minority contracting, looking at different minority-owned businesses and firms. Many people are not in favor of that. But a lot of people might like also that this prohibits future legislation. So you can't pass a law if you're a legislator in the legislature now that would be inconsistent with protecting these individuals from racial and ethnic discrimination. So why vote against this? Because it probably sounded pretty good when you first looked at it. Well, reverse discrimination cases, I just said I'm a white woman. I could bring a case and claim that I've been discriminated against. I'm sure many people read this and they didn't think about Caucasian and white people. So it's something to think about, that the interpretation of these cases often don't go, that these laws have bigger impacts than they may initially seem. So it's kind of like an impressionist painting, right? Like you're looking out, it might be blurry, but then you get close, or you get close, it's kind of blurry, but then you step back and you see the big picture of what it's all about. So you just want to make sure that you're okay with this, and it's okay to vote no, just as much as it's okay to vote yes, but understanding the impact of that, because existing law in Pennsylvania, it already forbids discrimination against any person in the exercise of any civil right. So again, it might be complicated to some. I'm totally cool with answering any questions. That's ballot question 3. I just talked about some that was the background I was looking for the for the other question. So ballot question 4, I think, has disappeared. Well, does anybody have any questions? Go ahead, Monica, while I find ballot question 4. Go ahead. I'm
So the
listening.
question is, if this law passes, would that force a workplace to abandon diversity efforts, like diversity fellows at colleges, for example, because diversity efforts would be seen as discriminating against white people?
That's a great question. Yes and no. So look, I'm not a constitutional law scholar. I am an attorney. This again is not an outright ban on those group considerations, which some might know as affirmative action, which I think are targeted words. But those group considerations, if challenged, could come to the court. And again, why it's so important, why we think about our judicial and we vote in our judicial elections, because if things could happen, a risk, it's also potentially that it could go the other way. With respect to that question, look, I'm not going to get too much into or even make myself a target. Eddie Graham was supposed to take these questions. But I will say that, just as much as there could be an interpretation about banning these potential considerations, there could also be an interpretation of expanding these kind of considerations. So again, why it's critical to thinking about the interpretation and understanding it is a risk also. Is that a risk we want to take and voting yes on this? That's really up to you. And also very empowering as a voter of whether we want to decide to put that up to the court. Right now, you might like the way the court is, and we have, again, we're one of few states that still has elected judges. There's only like 6 or 7 states left that elect judges. And it does become a partisan court. Right now, you might like it. A few years, we don't know. It could be a totally different bench. So it's really up to you whether you think that, but it's not an outright ban on these considerations, but it could be challenged under those terms that you pose to me, whoever that person
And
was.
what court did you say would decide on this?
That would be it would eventually lead up to the PA Supreme Court on this interpretation of it. And look, a lot of scholars have gone both ways, right? Like I do believe the ACLU, which I think we're all familiar with, they believe, look, it could, just as much as it could narrow the potential, it could also expand equal rights for race and ethnic considerations. But again, that's up to us whether we want to take that risk and put it to a court, or we want to have those interpretations under the current existing protections. And also very important, I heard this today, that this would parallel, I think there's some messaging out right now, that this would parallel the federal laws and the US Constitution. No, this is separate and distinct. This is Pennsylvania law. Okay, so separate and apart. And that's a lot of people like that we can add protections, possible protections. It could also be the other way, as we talked about, but we could do that under state law, separate from the Equal Protection Clause.
Yeah, and I just want to say too, for everybody that's on here, the Supreme Court in Pennsylvania has no diversity currently on it. So that's something to think about. These are the people that are going to be making these decisions. So you have to think about that when you turn it over, things like this, and you're understanding that they're going to be the ones that would ultimately make the decision. It's not necessarily representative of many of the people on this call. So that's just something else to take away with you.
I'm just gonna add, if there any other questions on that ballot question before, because I know it's getting a lot, well, I've been hearing about it a lot. So I just want to make sure that everybody had their questions answered.
Someone asked, can you speak to how they refuse to include LGBTQ rights?
Yeah, Great question. And as we're talking, I'm also adding into our into the slideshow the actual question for ballot question number 4. I think we do not in Pennsylvania. It's another thing that's very hard for me to even say to you all, that we do not have any protections for LGBTQ. You can legit be fired for being gay. That is really a stain upon our Commonwealth. I know that there was a hope to include that language here in our state constitution. So in our state constitution, we have our own Bill of Rights, our own Equal Protection Clause. That, unfortunately, that language was not included. And that might be another thing that you consider. Well, look, this isn't really protecting people who are not part of what we consider protected classes. Right now, if you were to go to the federal courts and claim racial discrimination, that race is a protected class. LGBTQ, it is not, unfortunately. Sexual orientation, it is not. And just important for other people, I got asked this question the other day when talking about these questions, that gender, people often think that gender is part of the Equal Protection Clause. And I'm part of the League of Women Voters, although it's open to all genders, however you prescribe or affiliate yourself or see yourself, all are welcome. But that is not the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA. That is not part of the US Constitution. So if you want to advocate for that, we could talk about those battles too. But we have one more question because it's already 8:30 and I know probably people have questions. And now this one's a really special one. I'm going to share my screen again because while I was talking, I also was putting in this ballot question. Can everybody see that? Ballot question 4? Yeah, okay, great. This is pretty interesting. I just want to tell everybody, this is not going through the process of all the other questions and the process that I talked about and the procedure for passing a constitutional amendment. And this is what's known as a referendum. So it's another weird thing. Pennsylvania's got all these weird rules and it's quite hard to make progress here. But this is an example of a fast track or emergency reason for putting a ballot question on the ballot. So it's considered a referendum. So do you favor expanding the use of the indebtedness authorized under the referendum for loans to volunteer fire companies, volunteer ambulance services, and volunteer rescue squads under, they give you the code related to referendum for additional indebtedness to include loans to municipal fire departments or companies that provide services through paid personnel and emergency medical service companies for the purpose of establishing and modernizing facilities. Okay, I'm just not even going to keep reading because this is really about what we already have in our PA Constitution, which allows for loans to fire and emergency or EMS companies. Volunteer, which nearly 90% of Pennsylvania's 2,000 some municipalities use volunteer services. So it's really important to have that. So what does it mean? I'm voting yes, because I think we should expand that current loan program to not only include volunteer, but paid municipal volunteer fire and EMS service companies. So it's expanding that pool of applicants from not just volunteers, but to paid municipal. We talked about earlier, Adrian gave you the presentation, why local elections matter, that budgeting that happens, the paid municipalities, your supervisors, your commissioners, that's what this would be. They could budget to allow this. But if you vote no, you're saying, no, I want to keep the loan program the way it is and make it available for volunteer fire and EMS companies and not to paid municipal fire and medical emergency companies. Okay, so it's pretty dense, the question, but the premise, again, PhD level that you need to read these questions. So what are some arguments for? Well, some arguments for are, well, this provides opportunity, right? For these, we right now, we're also, still in the COVID pandemic, and we know that EMS companies in particular, they need upgrades and replacement of equipment. So those paid municipalities so they pay toward the firehouse or the ambulance, they would be able to apply for these loans. And it increases the flexibility, that budgeting that Adrian and others talked about for local government, that you can shift because you'll be able to get a loan, you'll be able to use that for something else. And then it promotes, paid municipalities to upgrade and replace this equipment and facilities that is so needed. That was the purpose behind this bill and the fast track. So this isn't the 2 consecutive sessions and the notice and everything else that I talked about. This went straight to the legislature, passed, and came to us because it involves emergencies. But why would you vote against this? Well, this increases the application pool, which I told you is made up mostly of volunteer, or it is currently for volunteer fire companies. So it increases that applicant pool, but it does not increase the amount of money that is in that fund. So now we see more competition, but we don't actually see the increase in what they're applying for. And this would also put some budget constraints on the recruitment, which we have a serious need here in Pennsylvania. I was seeing some statistics that we went from 300,000 and the largest in the nation volunteer fire companies or status of firemen to 38,000. So we really need to make sure that they have all the resources that they need. And this really does put a lot of weight on that fire commissioner, who is the sole person in charge of administering and granting these loans. So this is going to increase their responsibility. And also some pull and tug, there's some partisanship that probably will go along with this, because you have the resources and the means as a municipality to apply for grants that you may not have as a volunteer organization. So there's a lot to discuss here. I know it's not the sexiest of topics, but it's very, very important. So if anybody has any questions about that, yes, this was passed overwhelmingly. But certainly, again, the last time this fund was increased was in 2002. So we are not voting on increasing that fund. We are voting on whether we think the applicant pool should be expanded or not. So there's no change to the procedure of the requirements for these grants. There's no change to how much this fund has. It's merely about the applicant pool. Okay, I'm sick of talking, but I will answer questions.
Okay, here we have some questions.
Okay.
I have Anna's I'm saving for last, because I think that's a great question, but these are about the loans. Are the loans to paid companies that are the loans paid back with taxpayer dollars, or is the municipality taking the loan, or the firehouse?
So I think this question is if this is passed, correct? Or what the current procedure is. There is a whole procedure about the loans. I'm not going to go into that because that does not change with this. But either way, whether this passes or not, these are loans to the fire companies and the EMS services. They do have requirements as to what they can use it for. So it's about replacement or upgrading facilities and equipment. But these are not, there are fixed terms that wouldn't change whether this is for the current volunteers or it's expanded to include the municipalities. The terms and how they're administered would not change.
And Gigi, who's a former elected official in Narberth, said the municipalities are obligated anyway to hold funds to replace equipment.
Yeah, so yes, Gigi, thank you for that context. Narberth especially, I live here in Lower Merion, Narberth region. I just want to say the EMS, particularly in the COVID, has just been outstanding and we owe them an incredible debt of gratitude. It is very, I would say over more than 90%, I was looking at statistics, are not paid municipal, but it is, I think, to incentivize to have municipalities fund local services. I know even with state police, you have to think about that many towns, boroughs, townships, they do not have the resources to have the emergency services that they need. So one reason that people may want to vote for this, and again, I'm not telling you how to vote, but one reason people may want to vote for this is to include that funding that maybe they don't have because it's hard economic times, they don't have the property taxes or the tax funding, and that this would be an additional means that they wouldn't have to take out an additional bond or loan or whatever it may be. But you might want to ask, even if you have that available to you. And there's great resources online. The PA governor has the PA Gov website, not governor, the PA Gov website has a whole slew of information about emergency services and the loan management. Again, this is not about changing the terms. This is about increasing or leaving the same the applicant pool for these loans.
Okay, and our final question here. Mark has a hand up, but
Okay.
I wanted to say.
And I have another question here too that Monica sent us.
Yeah, so if we do not cast a vote either way, if there's a majority of yes votes for any of these, they would then amend the Constitution, except for the question 4. The first 3 would amend.
Well, technically, question 4 does amend. It's just done in a different. It's part of the PA Constitution. It's part of the emergency powers section. But Adrian, you're right. It is different how it got to the ballot. But yes, to that question, it's a great question. And I hope that's not going to be you, though, that you're going to get everybody to vote and decide. I know these are complicated things. You're not really supposed to know. And I hope you really tell your friends and family and your neighbors, there are resources, there's videos online. I know this is being recorded. Other groups, whether the NAACP, the League, I told you, vote411.org. Call your representative too. Ask them how they voted on these. Because again, these are bills that they voted on that then came to us on the ballot. So these are all part of things. So overwhelmingly, these all pass. So I just want people to know there's power also in deciding how you want to vote, because since the 80s, there's been not one question has been shot down. They've all passed. The Marcy's Law Challenge, which you may all, because that voted as well, that is a challenge. It technically was on the ballot, but we at the League and other organizations, we challenged it because we're only supposed to be citing one amendment at a time, part of these questions, even though they don't really seem like it. And that Marcy's Law was what we call log rolling. It was many amendments, all log rolled into one. And that violates our state constitution. So that challenge is still being heard. Another reason why you got to vote for your judges. That is being appealed all the way to the PA Supreme Court and is being briefed right now. So again, you want to make sure that you know who you're voting for.
And Mark has a question.
Right, so for question number 4, right, I just want to be very basic and clear about what I'm hearing. So currently there's a grant program that we use for volunteer fire companies. And what they're asking us to vote, if we vote yes, we would be saying that that pot should now be open to everybody, not just the volunteer fire companies. So in essence, we could end up losing volunteer fire companies if they're not able to still, and the money's not changing, right? So we could end up losing volunteer fire companies because now they cannot financially sustain, what they need to do.
First of all, adorable baby that I just want to squeeze right now. But Mark, that is a possible outcome. However, I will say increasing the pool of applicants could also mean spreading that, and maybe having, you know, that would also be up to the fire commissioner or the person who oversees the grant process. But Mark, that is part of it. I think, you know, I'm nonpartisan in this aspect because I want everybody to see all sides of it. We do have, as I said, a very big problem with recruitment right now for volunteer firefighters or even emergency service individuals at all. So we want to make sure that they have all the resources they need. But again, yes, this would be increasing that. But there are also things we can do to advocate outside of this. I want to bring this up to people who are listening. Call your representative, tell them, put it in the budget. Make sure that if we get that CARES Act money, that all those EMS companies that work so hard, that they get the funding they need. So there are ways to advocate for additional funding for our very important emergency services. So I hope I answered that differentially. And I just want to put a plug for the league. Many of the things we all talked about here, open primaries, ranked choice voting, just getting out and supporting our elections, redistricting reform, fighting to end gerrymandering, making sure that the ERA is passed. I mean, on and on and on. The league, 101 years, still going strong. Students are free. Get out, vote. I don't care how you vote. I say you do you, whether you vote by mail, you go in person, just make sure you vote.
Ranked choice voting.
Yeah, I mean, hey, look at New York City right now. Not only are they going to have ranked choice voting for their mayoral race, but they also have campaign finance. They have matched dollars for campaign donations. So they pull away that power from large donors to small donors, and it evens the playing field. So I'm really excited to see what happens in that race. And maybe one day, I pray for Pennsylvania, we get it.
Thank you so much, Jamie. And thank everyone. I think this was a great event. It provided a lot of information. We are going to, for those of you that register, we're going to send out, you know, some of this information to you as a follow-up. But I just want to thank all of you, the panelists. You guys were amazing. I think this is very helpful. We're going to have a lot more events around and, you know, getting people prepared for the primaries. And so we have 4 candidate forums coming up. We have East Norton, West Norton candidate forum on Thursday, April 29th from 6 to 7:30. We have Norristown Council that same night, I think a little bit, it's the same night, right, Monica? A little bit different time. Then we have the school board candidates forum on Saturday, May 1st from 10 to 1. And then the magisterial judge candidate forum on Saturday, May 8th from 10 to 12. So look for information on social media or Facebook about that. The NAACP is also partnering with the Public Defender's Office for a resource fair. It's also an expungement event, but it's going to have lots and lots and lots of resources there on the 24th of April from 12 to 3. That's going to be in that big parking lot on Erie Street, right on the DeKalb and Erie. So that will be really fun. We're going to have a DJ out there, but really a good day for you to come out and get lots of information. And please, if nothing else, don't forget, primary election is on Tuesday, May 18th. Polls are open from 7 to 8. The last day to register to vote is May 3rd, 2021. And the last day to request a mail-in ballot or absentee ballot is May 11th, 2021. Now, everybody make sure you're prepared and ready and you vote like your lives depend on it, because they do. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
I just want to say also, because I don't know if this is brought up, but maybe it was, even if you're not 18 now, but you will be 18, or you know a son, daughter, sister, brother who's going to be 18 by election day, they get to register and they get to vote. So please let them know that they're eligible to register and vote.
Yes.
18 by May 18th.
By the election.
vote.
Yep. And if anybody, we are going to be doing some voter registration drives. We'll be out here in these streets registering people. If anybody wants to join us, we'll also post that on our Facebook account. So please, we'd love to have you. We try to have a lot of fun when we're talking to voters about the importance of voting in every single
Hey,
election.
Angie, real quick also, because this whole thing was about the primaries, right? And Jamie brought up New York, and it's so important to understand everything that is happening in New York was the result of people primarying the establishment in that city for the past couple of years. And we are seeing, I don't want to use the word progressive, right? But we are seeing a difference in how things are being handled. So primaries are important.
Yeah, last thing I'll say, we talked about a lot of things last year, right? When we were out here, Black Lives Matter, we were marching, we were protesting. I just want to remind you all, policies have not changed yet, okay? We're still talking about it. So if we want to really make sure we're pushing our legislators to do something, right, to take action, that's why we have to show up and vote in every single election, okay? Very, very important. Still no policies have changed yet, guys. We got to keep pushing, all right? Thank you all so much. Have a great night.
Happy voting.
Yes.